Yo, 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 all you sucker MCs ain't got nothing on me. From my grades to my lines, you can't touch Kevin G. I'm a mathlete, so nerd isn't bird, but forget what you heard. I'm like James Bond III, shaking, not stirred. I'm Kevin the Poor. The G is silent when I sneak in your door. I make love to your woman on the bathroom floor. I don't play it like Shaggy. You'll know it was me, cause the next time you see her, she'll be like, Kevin G.
Thank you, Kevin. That's enough.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Media, film, TV representation. In all of this, where do we fit in? This is an issue of more than just not enough representation. For some of us, it's about bad representation too. It's about how our countries are depicted, how we're seen in society, and the duality it causes between who we're construed to be and who we really are. And it seems like we're always ending up just one jump ahead of the punchline, or sometimes as the punchline itself. I'm Nidhi Shastri, and this is Model Minority, Uniquely American. Okay, get comfy in your seats and grab some popcorn, because we are jumping right into it. Y'all remember how in Aladdin, everybody was voiced by a white person?
One jump ahead of the breadline, one swing ahead of the sword. I steal only what I can afford.
Yep.
That's everything.
Or how Diane Nguyen, a canon Vietnamese American character on BoJack Horseman, was also voiced by a white woman.
I thought I was gonna be doing really important work, just writing stuff that makes a difference. Then you gotta fall into one thing and
1992 all the way to 2020. Hey, Frozen told us some things never change. Today, we're gonna get into the nitty-gritty of Asian, African, and Middle Eastern representation in Western media. And I'm going to start off with some issues that are East Asian specific, and then connect those with some issues in the South Asian, African, and Middle Eastern communities as well. So, East Asians are probably the most represented group in Western media of our bunch, but it's not always a good thing. While we saw films like Parasite and Crazy Rich Asians as a step forward for the Asian community, I want to talk about one specific issue I see from time to time in Western media when it comes to portraying East Asians, and that's that East Asians are in proximity to whiteness. For example, did anybody else notice the one East Asian guy in Get Out, or was that just me? In a 2017 article published in Bumble titled Why the Asian Character in Get Out Matters, the author states, Get Out is an extremely detailed and well thought out film, and the decision to have an East Asian man in the group, not a South Asian man or Latinx or Middle Eastern man or European, is a specific one. But no matter the intent, I wonder whether or not Peele thought specifically about how the American audience would view this character. Not only does the Asian man contribute to the stereotype of Asians as foreigners, but he also perpetuates the myth of the model minority. East Asians are sometimes seen as the minority closest to the white experience for a variety of reasons, and racism against Asians and Asian Americans is either considered firmly in the past or entirely forgotten. I have no doubt that, regardless of intent, some audiences will interpret the Asian character in Get Out as a confirmation that the Asian experience is the same as white Americans. And the fact that this message is seen on film, a medium that routinely excludes Asians from their own narratives and continues to lack Asian representation, it's incredibly ironic. Those were all the thoughts of the author of this piece, and honestly, they were my thoughts exactly when I noticed that character in the film. And even though I'm not East Asian, sitting in the theater seeing that character kinda hit home for me. Because during the duration of the film, I felt internally like I was identifying with the main black characters and their experience of weirdness around this white American family. The assumption and racism that many South Asians have experienced, especially living in post-9/11 America, and that feeling of discomfort that sort of sits with you sometimes in an all-white space, felt super relatable to me. And then, my eyes fell on the Asian character. He graces the screen for a matter of a few short minutes, and yet I couldn't get his presence off my mind. What did it mean? Was this some way of, again, equating East Asian identity to whiteness? And even if it is, why am I, as a South Asian, so offended? The author of this piece ends her article with the line, "The discussion of race relations between Asians and African Americans is an important one, and it deserves more than a throwaway line and a few short scenes." The reality is that the presence of this character actually furthers the model minority myth, and that's probably why I was so offended by it. This isn't just an issue in Get Out, and there are many films who also do this to Asian characters, South, East, and Southeast Asians alike. But it's still a problem, and I think we need to be talking about it. For more on this, check out the episode on the racial wedge, which I did a few episodes back. But all in all, we need to remember that adjacency to whiteness is a fabrication, and as we've seen with COVID times, it can be rescinded at any moment. Yet media, in a way, is immortal. So, to some respect, so are the connotations that we get from them. Next, I want to talk about how Western society consumes Eastern media. And while I think this idea is applicable to the larger Asian demographic as a whole, I want to fixate on one sector of the East Asian demographic, Japanese culture. And since this episode is about, well, TV and media, you might have guessed what I'm about to say. Anime. Let me preface this by saying, 1, I love anime. 2, no, weeaboo is not a racial slur. And 3, yes, people out there exist who think weeaboo is a racial slur. But all of that aside, anime is probably the best cartoon animation art form out there. We've seen it break our hearts in sad scenes like in Bleach. Mess with our minds in mind-bending series like Death Note and Full Metal.
Watch me, Al. I'll solve equations with my right hand and write names with my left. I'll take a potato chip and eat it.
And we've even been down on the floor laughing from shows like One Piece and RN High School Host Club.
やっちゃったね。僕ら知らない。
バカ者！お前らがぶつかってきたんだろうが!
And it's really become this whole sort of global phenomenon, which is super amazing. People all around the world have been able to share and enjoy this media, and we've seen it seep into modern American culture as well, even with things like Pokemon and Avatar, and as Netflix begins producing its own anime series. So you're probably wondering, why is Nidhi mentioning this? What's the catch? Well, this might be a bit controversial, but here's my take. This application for anime in the West has turned into more of an obsession or infatuation with everything and anything Japanese. This is a problem for a couple different reasons, as it furthers things like fetishization of Japanese women, appropriation of Japanese culture and language, and even simply an over-glorification of Japan as this wonderland of anime, which increases missionary or white savior-like trips that many white Americans take to go there. Now, this is a complicated issue, and honestly, I can do a whole episode on this topic to address its many facets. And a lot of what I'm going to say is rooted in my opinion. But I'll do my best to keep it succinct for this episode because I still feel like it needs to be addressed. There are words that were created in popular society to address this very concept. Japanophilia is just one example of it. But it's a weird thing for another reason too. Some of the people consuming and becoming obsessed with Japanese culture and anime are incels and white supremacists. A 2018 article in the Japanese Time titled "White Supremacists and Japan, a Love Story" examined multiple cases where white supremacists who were convicted for being such were oddly into Japanese culture, language, and, you guessed it, anime. The article states, even mass murderer Anders Breivik the neo-Nazi who killed 96 people at a Labour Party Island youth retreat in 2011, is an ardent Japanophile. In his manifesto, he specifically praised Japan as a quote-unquote model country for avoiding multiculturalism. Supremacists see Japan as a viable nation alternative, not only because Japan can get away with policies that embed racism and keep immigrants out, but also, more importantly, because Japan gets the acceptance and respect of other rich countries regardless. The white samurai now joins the ranks of other historical figures who have defended Japan from charges of institutionalized racism. Now, this is really fascinating stuff, and I highly suggest you take the time to read through this article because it really dives deep into the complexity of this issue, both on Japan's part and Americans. But we can't also ignore the other group listed here, incels. Let's really think about this for a minute. If white incels are really into anime and Japanese culture, imagine what type of women they're going to fixate on and fetishize. Yeah, now that is scary. Oftentimes, people haven't even bothered to actually learn about the history of trauma for Japanese Americans, having to forgo their culture and their language and assimilate into post-World War II America. And yet, anime culture and its relation to the West has created a seemingly acceptable and under-discussed space for white people to A, embrace Japanese culture as if it's their own, and B, reduce Japanese culture to a very specific and sometimes misconstrued extension of anime. And this fixation isn't just from America to Japanese culture. It happens in other places with other cultures too. Let's talk about Bollywood.
चांद जमीन पर कैसे उतर आया?
तुम्हारे होश उड़ाने.
There are significant portions of people in European countries or even here in the States who become really, really into Bollywood. And I think that's great. I mean, we all need a little bit of Shah Rukh Khan in our lives to lighten things up.
अरे वैसी मोहब्बत कहाँ रह गई? अर्ज किया है मोहब्बत के ज़माने गुजर गए जनाब, मोहब्बत के ज़माने गुजर गए जनाब, अब छोटे-मोटे प्यार से ही काम चला लीजिए आप, हाँ?
But what ends up happening is that it seeps into how they interact with others. For example, when talking to me in some cases, they're not really seeing me or my culture. Oftentimes, it's really easy to tell when this is the case. Instead, they're seeing me through these Bollywood-colored glasses where we all break out into song and dress in super fancy clothes. And while I guess that's true for a wedding or something like that, the fixation on that image as a representation of India and Indian culture strikes me as uncomfortable, especially as an Indian American. But it doesn't stop there. Oftentimes, some of these people will start wearing Indian clothes and try to act more Desi. My problem with this is two things. One, the infatuation and fetishization of brown people, which leads to more fetishized relationships while ignoring the existing racism and oppressive structure for Desis in this country who have tried to embrace their culture. And two, the monetization on Indian culture by places like Urban Outfitters without any economic benefit of the West's infatuation going to help people actually in India. The best example of this is Vera Bradley's brand. If you don't know about this brand, look it up. It's basically the overpriced backpacks and lunchboxes that almost every girl in school owned. And the irony is that some of those same girls look at me weirdly if I expressed any semblance of my culture, even if that was so much as eating some roti and achar for lunch. But honestly, it's most annoying to see the constant monetization of a culture and a country that is so obviously impoverished and struggling, with no regard, no acknowledgement, or funds actually going back to help them. Especially when a lot of these products, I hate to break it to ya, come from their cotton mills, their underpaid labor, and their exploitation. So, while I don't believe people shouldn't share their culture or grow their knowledge about the world, I just think with all the history of the West taking advantage of and looting other places and people, leaving them impoverished, it's really ironic, the infatuation some seem to have with them now. But I digress from that rabbit hole, and I'm trying to keep this more about media and less about cultural appropriation. So, Anime and Japanese culture case study isn't exactly equivalent to the Bollywood and Indian culture one, but going back to Japanese culture and anime, here's how it relates to the broader issue. People who think they're transracial.
Are you black?
Yes.
With a smile, Rachel Dolezal is finally speaking out, holding firm and not backing down. The former Spokane chapter president of the NAACP, whose racial ethnicity continues to be questioned, tells MSNBC that she's been black for a long time.
From a very young age, felt spiritual, visceral, just very instinctual connection with Black is beautiful, just the Black experience.
Saying when she was a little white girl in Montana drawing pictures of herself, she preferred the brown crayons over the peach-colored ones.
Let me just say, being transracial is not a thing. But we've seen this most commonly with white people pretending to be black or biracial people of color, and using that to advance their career and appropriate. Yep, the whole Rachel Dolezal NAACP issue has been revealed to be happening all over the country. Now, for Asians, this issue appears in a slightly different way, and I see it most with South Asian and Japanese cultures, but not limited to them. It's this idea of, I was born into the wrong culture or skin type, and I identify with more XYZ language or culture. I find this concept really weird. In a 2017 article in The Independent titled, "Man Born White Says He's Transracial and Feels Filipino," we see a perfect example of this fixation of Western Americans on claiming Eastern cultures. The article states, Du, who was born Adam Wheeler, said he grew up enjoying the culture of the Philippines before coming to the realization of being transracial. He now leads an online community for transracial people.
He was born white, but says he's Filipino. It may remind you about this woman, Rachel Dolezal. Remember her? She's the woman who was born white, but portrayed as black, and led the NAACP in Washington.
I interviewed a man named Adam who was born Caucasian, but now he told me he believes inside he feels like he's Filipino. He's an interesting character nonetheless.
Whenever I'm around the music, I'm around the food, I feel like I'm in my own skin. I'd watch the History Channel sometimes for hours, whenever it came to that, and nothing else intrigued me more but things about Filipino culture.
He also drives a tuk-tuk around Tampa, Florida, which is commonly used for public transport in the Philippines. Okay, I'm not gonna laugh, but what? Okay, so since we need to get back to the issue of media representation, I'm gonna try to keep this short. You cannot be transracial, regardless of what race you start as or what race you try to end up to be. Also, transracial people have no semblance of the racial hurt and the trauma of the actual race or culture that they're trying to assimilate into. And no, this concept is not the same thing as being transgender, and if you want to know why, Google can help you out there. Transracial people are not a thing, and I guarantee you can learn to enjoy and appreciate a culture without trying to become it. I promise. Also, I want to point out that this is not limited to white people. Any non-Japanese or non-Asian person, for that matter, can have this infatuation with another culture, including other Asians. But my biggest takeaway from this is for people who like other cultures to not be insulted by this criticism. Rather, to look inward and think, at what point am I no longer seeing a race, a culture, or a person for who they are? Am I looking at the world through my anime or my Bollywood-colored glasses? And does it affect the way that I interact with other people, especially those of that culture? In other words, am I making this weird? In episode 6, I spoke with Tushar Lal, an Indian composer and musician and YouTuber. He's got some great things to say about this infatuation too, so if you want to hear more about it, check out that episode. And if you want this discussion to be a whole episode, drop me a note on Facebook or on Instagram. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. I want to jump into something that was trending on Twitter this year, and that is called the third world filter. So, for African and South or Southeast Asian immigrants, we know this all too well. Many times, our home countries are used for very particular, quote-unquote, barbaric backdrops. And this yellow filter was a trending topic on Twitter earlier this year, when the film Extraction, starring Chris Hemsworth, was released on Netflix.
This is an extraction.
So who are the players?
Biggest drug lord in India versus biggest drug lord in Bangladesh.
Some mythic shit, huh?
It's a kidnapping. Drug lord's son.
There was one particular thing that stood out. This film was shot in Bangladesh, and it had this yellow tint on nearly every scene. This yellow tint has been seen before, and it's mostly used in Western films set in places like South Asia, African countries, Southeast Asian countries, and even Latino countries. And it's weird, because as most of us probably know, these places don't actually look like that. No one really knows why Hollywood loves placing these filters over these places, but one thing we can infer is that it makes them seem more dirty, dusty, dangerous, and spontaneous. And honestly, it makes them look kind of ugly and uncivilized too. While this might be perfect for Hollywood set, it's a pretty laughable feature for most global or well-traveled citizens of the world who know this is simply not reality. If you're not convinced, watch a Bollywood film. No yellow tinted sky there, I promise. I want to focus on African immigrants as a demographic who are largely invisible in Hollywood. With the release of Black Panther, there was a slight momentary increase in awareness, but as we can infer, it simply wasn't enough. This is because for a lot of Africans, much like South Asians, their home countries are depicted in a negative light. And seeing that this is the bulk of the representation that they're getting in Western media or film, it leaves us with a sad reality that African immigrants are left to live with the remnants of that image in American society. The idea, similar to South Asian and Middle Eastern countries, is that these people have left a terrible place, and the perception of these countries and their people by others as a result range from simply highly uneducated assumptions about things like sewage systems or crime in these places, to blatant racism and stereotyping about a person's culture or country of origin. And those of us who have experienced the effects of that know exactly what I mean. People often rely on what they see on TV or through media to inform them of how the world is in reality. And it's not difficult to see how problematic of a thing that is. But the fact of the matter is that it hurts people in real time. And as our society becomes more global, it's a bit outdated and sad that this perception issue is still so prevalent today. Furthermore, many African immigrants or otherwise Black actors get limited or reduced to playing the roles of criminals or gang members or other reductive and ignorant stereotypes. The irony is that a first-generation African actor could be playing one of these roles in the States, and people in Africa could be watching it and thinking about how dangerous African Americans seem to be. This is all in thanks to how Hollywood portrays Black people, and we talked about this more back in the Racial Wedge episode. As for South Asians and Middle Eastern immigrants and Americans in TV and film, we have the obvious shopkeeper or convenience store trope. Most infamous example is probably Apu from The Simpsons.
Who needs the quickie mart? I do.
Hey, he's not happy at all.
A problematic character for a variety of reasons, such as how he was voiced by a white guy, or how he had so many kids, a nod to the whole India is overpopulated stereotype. There is a lot of content out there on this topic, including an entire documentary, so do check that out for more info. But the best way I can frame what's wrong with the character of Apu is that most of the characters on The Simpsons were caricatures of different white stereotypes. Homer was the deadbeat dad, and Flanders was the crazy Christian. Apu's most hilarious feature seemed to be that he was Indian. And here's my friend Ali talking a bit more about it.
My parents and I, we love The Simpsons. And, you know, we liked having a character like Apu on the show because, you know, even if it was a not the best representation, it was a representation. You know, people probably wouldn't have been able to look at an Indian person and say, oh, like that's an Indian person, if they weren't exposed to that kind of level of like, this is what it is. I think that having a bad representation at times might be better than having no representation at times.
My friend Nuha actually also expressed her thoughts on this issue.
The voice actor for Apu agreed. He's like, if an Indian person wants to take my role and wants to make it something their own, yes, let them. Like, this is not my place to speak as a white man. But, like, the showrunners and so many things, like, they've changed their character, like, to be, like, a clapback at the movie or the documentary. They had Lisa, who's historically been this kind of social justice, activist, and someone who's aware of all these problems. They had her talk about, like, how people are so sensitive nowadays. And it's like, dude, do you not know your character at all? And then, like, other white Simpsons fans will be all like, in this episode, in season 13, episode 8, Apu was shown to have a passion for literature or something like that, something weird. And it's like, this is not an overarching thing. This isn't, like, what people think of when they see the, character, and people aren't, like, hardcore not everybody who's ever watched Simpsons is a hardcore Simpson fan who's watched every single episode. Like, you see one episode on TV or two, you catch it here or there, and if you see Apu, he's like the convenience store owner. He has an accent. He does like these little funny Indian dance. I don't know what. I've hardly seen The Simpsons. All these things assume that we're a monolith, And I think, especially older generations, they don't understand how harmful the model minority myth can be. That we have to be like good at this and good at that, especially when you're struggling.
South Asian and Middle Eastern immigrants as convenience store owners in cities or gas stations is still seen in media all over the place today. I remember seeing a scene like this in actually a movie that I love on Netflix. And that movie was supposed to be a step forward for representation, but I think the biggest caveat, as we see with Crazy Rich Asians, is that even in the most quote-unquote representative films can sometimes exhibit humor at the cost of another marginalized group. And how I see it, if that humor comes at the expense of another marginalized group, then it's not really original comedy. Racist, sexist, and homophobic jokes aren't funny. They're lazy. And if you want to be funny, maybe come up with something more original. I'm looking at you, Jerry Seinfeld. Another common trope is the model minority. The super nerdy, smart, but also really fobby Indian kid that Disney Channel loves to use.
What's up, LG? Your band is waiting for you on stage.
I can't do it! I just do not know how to rock! I know I'm going to get a bad grade!
Wait, what are you talking about, grades? This is Summer Rocks. There are no grades.
No grades? Oh, so it is pass-fail?
No, we use a free-floating curriculum to encourage kids to just rock out and have fun.
I do not believe this! I wasted all this time in a class without grades! Oh! If only there was some other kind of outlet for me to express these feelings to my like-minded peer group!
Princess, I am so touched by your love. I shall undo the spell I cast upon him. But first, we dance.
Wait, why?
Because it is the end of a Bollywood movie. It is what we do.
One in Ranchpur.
This is contrasted with the other most common role for us Desis and Arabs, the terrorist trope. If you follow most brown actors in Hollywood, you'll know how many of them had to take at least one of these roles. In a 2003 peer-reviewed publication titled Real Bad Arabs, How Hollywood Vilifies a People, it states, based on the study of more than 900 films, this study shows how moviegoers are led to believe that all Arabs are Muslim and all Muslims are Arabs. The movie maker's distorted lens has shown Arabs as heartless, brutal, uncivilized, religious fanatics through common depictions of Arabs kidnapping or raping a fair maiden, expressing hatred against the Jews and Christians, and demonstrating a love for wealth and power. But that's not all. Another study titled Arabs and Muslims in Media Race and Representation After 9/11, states, in 2004, the Council on American Islamic Relations accused the TV drama 24 of perpetuating stereotypes of Arabs and Muslims. The council objected to the persistent portrayal of Arabs and Muslims in the context of terrorism, stating that, quote, repeated association of terrorism with Islam will only serve to increase anti-Muslim prejudice. The council's critics have retorted that programs like 24 are cutting edge, reflecting that one of the most pressing and social political issues of the moment is the war on terror. And an article in The Guardian from 2017, although it's centered in the UK, says a lot on this just by its title, which states, there was a period when virtually all brown characters were terrorists. As we know, this is true for America as well. While Western media was struggling to get things right, Bollywood was experimenting with doing things differently. In 2009, a film called Qurban came out, and it had this clip that went viral on YouTube and Facebook.
The word jihad is mentioned in the Quran about 41 times. The words mercy, peace, and compassion are mentioned about 355 times. Yes, come in.
Come on in, Riaz. Sit down, please. Contrary to popular belief in most Western cultures, Islam is a religion that preaches peace and tolerance. Yes, Patricia.
If Islam truly is a religion that preaches peace, then how come the world's most troubled spots, the West Bank, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, they're all plagued with Islamic terrorism?
Well, that depends on your definition of terrorism. Some might argue that the US invasions of countries like Iraq and Afghanistan are also acts of terrorism.
Those were acts of war to get rid of despotic regimes.
Or a means of getting at a country's oil.
Conspiracy theories.
Well,
may I?
Yes, please. Go ahead, Riaz.
Mr. Khan is right. I mean, if we're talking about terrorists, the world's biggest terrorists are the white superpowers.
Come on now.
No, really, stop and think about it.
Explain 9/11.
Okay. Do you know how many people died in the Twin Towers strike?
Around 3,000.
And do you have any idea how many people died in the bombing on Afghanistan? Take a wild guess. More than 15,000 people died. And that's just conservative figures. About 50,000 tons of explosives were dropped on innocent civilians. Men, women, children.
Yeah, but that was because of the Taliban.
Now that you brought it up, did you know that the Taliban was a creation of the CIA? To fight the Russians.
Whatever. They were still harboring terrorists.
Yeah, right. Terrorists that were never found. Just like the weapons of mass destruction that were never found in Iraq. Do you want to get into the death toll in Iraq? 500,000 civilians and counting. And what do Britain and America say when they don't find these weapons? It's simple. They just say sorry. And still refuse to relinquish control of these countries.
What are you trying to say?
What I'm trying to say is that just because you're American, wear a fancy suit, and call yourself the president, doesn't make you any less of a terrorist. I'm saying that if you don't stop meddling in other people's countries, you will face a backlash.
If Muslims like you feel that way, then why don't you get out of our country?
We will. As soon as you promise to leave ours.
And in 2010, Shah Rukh Khan and Kajol starred in the film My Name is Khan, which dealt directly with how Muslim Americans and South Asians were treated in post 9/11 America.
Would you come with me, sir? Why are you going to Washington, D.C.?
I have something to say to the President of the United States. My name is Khan, and I'm not a terrorist.
While these films were popular in the West with Desi American audiences, they definitely didn't have the reach that other Western films do in Hollywood. So, for the black and brown portions of the model minority community, it's not just the fact that we're underrepresented, even within the few Asians that get on screen. It's that, even when we are represented, we're given a bad rap. But Desi culture has also been dragged by some of our own as well. For every Hassan Minhaj out there, there's probably somebody dragging us for being brown on the other side. Now, what do I mean by this, you ask? Well, let me tell you about a film that I really hated. So much that I couldn't even watch past half of it. It's called The Big Sick.
I've been dating this girl. A white girl! It's okay. We hate terrorists.
I started this movie with high hopes, guys. A Desi guy from Chicago driving Uber, just my type of film. Except, not really. This film was basically the main character having a whole realization about how his culture is bad and how he should give it up for his white girlfriend love interest, who, by the way, decided to throw a whole fit about how his mom kept sending him rishtas, or proposals for arranged marriage, even after he explained the concept to her and how it didn't matter to him that his mom was sending him those. Like, watch the film to see what I mean.
Are you judging Pakistan's next top model?
You know how we have arranged marriage in my culture?
Oh my god, I'm so stupid.
Or don't, because perhaps it's not worth your time. But either way, understand that I'm not a fan of it. So it really kind of sucks to see that within the representation we do have, there is always space to be misconstrued. What's that saying? All skin folk ain't kinfolk. Now, I want to circle back to religion for just a minute. The main character in The Big Sick was depicted to be Muslim by his family, but there's a whole scene where he doesn't pray, so perhaps he wasn't. But let's talk about some other Asian religions, Hinduism and Buddhism. These religions are highly misconstrued and appropriated in TV and film, mostly ones that are centered around white people. They become a sort of hippy-dippy exotic thing, such as in the Netflix show You, during that weird yoga getaway scene, or also in Jane the Virgin, with the character of Aaron, who is Jane. Not the character, but Jain the religion, which is an Indian religion that shares a lot of its core principles with Hinduism. So these religions are typically depicted as kind of weird, either that or really fobby and foreign. And it leads to a lot of misrepresentation that people bring to South Asians or Southeast Asians who practice these religions. I'm referring to the whole, oh, Hinduism is the one where the gods have like a bunch of arms and they're half elephant, right? So for many of us, this is a common experience, but it's contrasted with how some other pagan religions are depicted. For example, Greek and Roman mythology. Granted, these are no longer really practiced. They are in some ways similar to Hinduism. Although the parallels between the two religions of Hindu mythology and Greek mythology are kind of similar, there's three main gods and various other gods who have autonomy and free will, the perception and depiction of them in media is so different that many people wouldn't even think to compare the two. One is fobby and weird, and the other is cool and fascinating. And I think this matter extends further than simply how the media depicts each of them, but I certainly think that the media plays a large role in how we view them. Alright, so let's take a step back for a second and examine this duality. On one hand, we have the depiction of some South Asians mainly as these hyper-studious, perfectionist nerds like in Phineas and Ferb or Mean Girls, Kevin G. And at the same time, we have the depiction of South Asian countries as barbaric and dangerous with that beautiful yellow tint. And then on top of that, you have the depiction of South Asians or Arabs as terrorists. And you know what? It doesn't end there, because if not any of those, South Asians will be depicted along with other Middle Eastern immigrants as low-income store clerks who barely know English. So, which is it, America? This is exactly how we know that the model minority myth is a sham. Even Hollywood couldn't stick to it, even though they certainly try to. And yet, people still choose to believe this. They have categories for the type of brown or the type of black you can be, based on what stereotype they choose to stick on you from Hollywood. Are you the nerdy brown or the 7-Eleven brown? Are you the hood black or the taxi driver black? But even just the existence of these ranging stereotypes, we know society acknowledges to some extent the various diverse pockets of South Asian and Black communities. So why won't America let go of this myth? Why won't we evolve our definition? Because that would mean having to actually acknowledge model minorities, all of them, as actual minorities, and it would mean having to see our communities fully, with real problems and real diversity that perhaps America needs to own up to. And frankly, looking at the state of our country today, it's pretty clear that people probably wouldn't care to examine these things with that much nuance. But we still talk about it. We still discuss it because we want to learn and grow and progress forward as a society together. And hey, let me just say that I'm so proud of us. I'm so proud of the model minority community taking media into our own hands and often trailblazing the way for us to share our own stories. We've seen that with the rise of Asian YouTubers. For those of us who are in our 20s now, we remember growing up watching these amazing people on YouTube, like Kev Jumba and Kasim G, who both belong to our identity groups of being model minorities. And they weren't afraid to put themselves out there and do something uniquely American. As for me, well, I have to say that I must have been pretty influenced by them, because now I'm sharing my Asian voice in hopes of doing the same, taking our presence in media into our own hands and providing an inimitable history of South Asian voices that dissented and spoke up about social issues. So despite how this model minority construes us, I thank you for being on this journey with me and taking the time to listen. And my advice to you is to never be afraid to share your voice, especially when you're standing up with other people for a better world. And that's it for this week's episode. I'd love to know your thoughts on this one, so definitely drop me a note on Facebook or Instagram to discuss this further. My handle is @model.minority.u.a. If you liked what you heard and you want to contribute, you can find my Patreon and drop some pennies in the hat. It's at patreon.com/modelminority. And as always, shukriya, thank you for listening, and I'm glad to have you here.